We already know that mindfulness can be very helpful to those who are dealing with cancer in their lives. But one of the things we don't understand quite as well, and we're learning more about each and every day, is the mechanisms of how mindfulness is helping. And rumination, that constant cycling of thoughts, is one of those mechanisms. Hi, my name is Ted Meissner. Welcome to Mindfulness Voyage, and today we're going to be learning about new research on mindfulness and rumination for those who are experiencing cancer. Our guest today is Hanna Conradi. Hanna, thank you so much for being here. I am really looking forward to our conversation today.
Oh my gosh, I'm so excited to be here, Ted. Thank you.
I'm so glad, because I saw this research come in and recognized some of the names working on it and reached out to you because this is a really interesting topic for us to get into. So before we dive into that, can you say just a little bit about who you are and what you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm Hannah, as you mentioned. I'm a PhD student at the University of Calgary in the clinical psychology program. And my research is supervised by Dr. Linda Carlson, who you know, and she does psychosocial oncology research and specifically looks at mindfulness-based interventions and mind-body interventions to help people living with cancer. And so, yeah, I guess that's who I am and what I'm doing. And yeah, my research, which we'll get into in a second, kind of merges the worlds of mindfulness and emotion regulation.
Thank you for that overview. And this is one of the things that I like having conversations about this particular topic as a cancer survivor and not having the kinds of research and interest in how mindfulness can help with that.
Mhm.
That was something I had in my own life, but for many people who are experiencing cancer and going into oncology treatments is this is something they don't typically have. So seeing more research like yours focusing on that is tremendous. So why don't you say a little bit about what is the research that we're going to be talking about today? What was it?
Yeah, so I mean, this was my master's thesis. So I just completed, now I'm doing my PhD, but I just completed my master's in the same area. And I was looking at it's actually data from a clinical trial, a waitlist controlled randomized clinical trial on a mindfulness app for cancer survivors that was like developed by my supervisor, Dr. Linda Carlson, and Dr. Michael Specca. Quite interesting because it's kind of the first mindfulness app for cancer survivors that's been developed by clinicians specifically for this context. So quite a novel kind of intervention. But my master's thesis didn't quite get into the app stuff, so maybe that's we can talk more about like what I'm doing now, which will be looking more at the intervention data. But my master's thesis was on the available baseline data at the time that I defended. So it's funny if you look at I had pre-registered my study on OSF, Open Science Framework. And what I had proposed at that point, thinking I'd have a much larger sample size, this is probably a very familiar story for most researchers, was different than what I ended up being able to do, the models that I had the power to test at the time that I defended, because I just didn't have big enough sample size. But still quite a large sample size. I believe it was 134 cancer survivors. And the research was looking at, so in my undergrad, I did emotion regulation research. And so that's part of the reason that there was a good fit in the Carlson lab for me, because she had this study kind of planned and knew she wanted to look at some emotion regulation factors. Specifically, whether changing emotion regulation is the mechanism by which mindfulness practice works to improve outcomes, such as depression, anxiety, fatigue, all the outcomes that we know mindfulness practice improves. And so that's really what I was interested in looking at with my master's thesis. Because it was baseline data, it was cross-sectional. So I couldn't, we can't look at causation there, but it was kind of to set up what questions I could then ask with the intervention data, right? So it's really informing the more causal data. And so I was able to test these models that were called mediation models, where you look at if mindfulness is at a particular level, does that predict rumination, for example, which we consider a kind of avoidant emotion regulation factor, where we're just repetitively thinking kind of negatively in a circle, not able to kind of quite get to problem solving or reflection. If mindfulness predicts rumination levels, and if that then predicts or is associated with, because this isn't causal, lower levels of depression, anxiety, fatigue, fear of cancer recurrence. And I also looked at kind of avoidance in general. So experiential avoidance as a whole, as a mediator as well, or as a mechanism. And so the idea, of course, I'm sure you're very familiar being a mindfulness expert and teacher, that the idea is that as we become more mindful, as we're practicing mindfulness, we're able to kind of make better decisions about how to regulate our emotions. So when things happen, that kind of reperceiving or diffusion happens, where we're able to observe the internal state, whatever emotions are coming up, whatever thoughts are coming up, and make more informed choices about how to respond to that. And so usually avoidance and rumination are pretty automatic. Like we're not necessarily choosing to do that in a particular moment in response to an emotion. And so that's why mindfulness is kind of theorized to reduce these I don't want to say maladaptive, but maybe less helpful automatic emotion regulation tendencies. And ultimately, what I found with my research was that rumination was a mediator, was a mechanism to depression and anxiety, as well as fear of cancer recurrence, but not to fatigue. So that's kind of interesting. And that then brings up the question of like, well, what's the mechanism that's, maybe accounting for why fatigue is being reduced when people are more mindful? Maybe it's not rumination. And then for avoidance, my models didn't find a significant mediation effect of avoidance. So that's something I think maybe because it was baseline data, it's limited. So I think I'll still be testing, avoidance in general in my future models, but we can get into that in a bit. But I feel like I've been talking a long time. Did that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I want to do a bit of a level set with those who are watching or listening, however you're consuming this episode, is that when one has in particular, a difficult diagnosis like cancer,
Yes.
and potentially a life-threatening one,
Mhm.
is that there may be a lifetime of habit practice, of mindless habit practice, of rumination, the constant thinking, which can directly lead to, well, what are you thinking about? Oh, what's going to happen? What am I, why me? What am I going to survive this? What's the treatment going to be like? How is this affecting my relations? All of this stuff that
Yeah.
keeps coming up again and again. And that is not a wrong thing.
Mhm.
That's simply what the brain does when we're faced with a highly charged, intense kind of context, a situation that we're in.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so, with that, working with, okay, so what are the corollaries? And one of the things I really like that you mentioned is this isn't causation. This is correlations. Like, do we see these things arising at the same time? And then maybe we can build out and learn more to get to a causation. Does
Yeah.
mindfulness actually influence this, or did they, do you happen to already be mindful, or what does that look like? And that's why some of these kinds of research is just determining, okay, what are we seeing? Others are pre and post. Was there a change? Is there a delta in this? And what it sounds like we're seeing here is that rumination, the mind spinning, mindfulness may have an influence on that. There
Yeah.
seems to be a relationship there.
Yeah.
And that in turn, this is another piece you said so beautifully, is that it's not just mindfulness equals emotion regulation. There's a pathway, and there are different aspects to that. And
Mhm.
I also noticed this is in the title of the paper as well, that it seems there's a difference between how uh, men and women, and setting aside for the moment the many different ways in which people have gender identification, is that has an influence too. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because that was also an
Sure.
interesting aspect of your research.
Yeah, yeah. And, unfortunately, I think in the future, I'll want to be able to measure more like gender identity factors as well. Like we were very limited in our data set that we were only capturing sex. Like we asked people male or female or other, and those were the only options. So we're limited by that. And then also limited by, I mentioned in my paper that there was a difference in that the effect of rumination, or not the effect, the association um, of rumination in the relationship between mindfulness and depression, anxiety were strongest in women or in females, people who reported to be female. Um, and this was when we did kind of subgroup analyses. So that kind of significance, statistical significance of rumination in that model only remained for females when we compared it to males. And I believe that was only for depression and anxiety and not for the other factors. So this is kind of an interesting thing because I'm like, because this is such it's a, again, limited kind of sample, limited design. I would be very curious when we look at more causal data if that pattern holds up. I think something that could be happening there too is that women do, we know in the literature, report more rumination or ruminating more. And we know there's limitations with self-report measures as well. Like, is it really true that women or females ruminate more? Or is there something else going on here? So I think it's a very curious question that I'm going to keep asking. And I would encourage people doing this research to keep looking at kind of different demographic characteristics as moderators, because I think we don't necessarily know yet how different groups might be impacted by mindfulness differently, whether there's a different need across different groups for mindfulness practice. So, those are important questions to ask, right? So that we can modify our interventions based on who's receiving them.
And this is such
But
an important aspect that you're talking about here is that modification of interventions, that it's not
Mhm.
just here's the one and true program that works in exactly the same way for everybody because everybody's not the same.
Yeah,
And this interesting stratification of where people are coming from, what their background is. There can also be cultural influences to that. As you're
Mhm.
speaking the idea of there may be more rumination, at least reported,
Mhm.
from women than from men. I think, yeah, in the US, raised in a culture where men are not supposed to get in touch with their feelings. And so that has an influence on our rumination
Mhm.
capacity or approach to that. And that may be different in different cultures. It may be completely different with different different aspects of where people are in their life, their socioeconomic status, with race, with
Yeah.
where they all sorts of different things. There are lots of different ways to chop up that data.
Absolutely. And I think, with the rumination piece too, you have to consider like stress levels, right? So different groups are exposed to different stressors. And I think that's one kind of theory that's out there for why women might report higher rumination is because maybe women are exposed to more different kinds of stressors. And so, we're just trying to regulate and rumination is something that naturally comes up.
Yeah. Yeah, and yeah, so many factors. So much interesting that's going to be coming up with ongoing research in this field, and you also mentioned some things you would like to do next, or that you're working on now. I'm wondering if
Yeah.
you can say what you can say about that here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, so I'm still working on the seamless trial. So what's exciting is that I'll be able to, hopefully for my dissertation defense, be able to look at that post-intervention data and have some causal conclusions that I can draw about this relationship between mindfulness and emotion regulation and outcomes. And so what I'm really interested in and will be able to do with this like larger data set and this causal data is look at a sequential ordering as well as of the like mediators or the emotion regulation factors, which I'll talk about. And then the other piece is that I'm able to look at symptom clusters. And so I don't know where to start with that. Maybe I'll start with symptom clusters. So we know in cancer survivors, as well as like, in general, that symptoms cluster together, right? There's multiple symptoms kind of show up together and can be interrelated, go up together, go down together. And so something that this brings up is the question of, what is maybe key, the underlying or the shared mechanism that's accounting for why these symptoms are showing up together, getting worse together, getting better together as a result of mindfulness. And so that's where this question of like these emotion regulation factors as mechanisms becomes even more interesting, right? Because it's also maybe getting at this question of maybe rumination is why depression and anxiety are hanging together, or one of the reasons, right? And that's why if you reduce rumination by being more mindful, look at that, depression and anxiety go down together. So it just adds kind of to this story and adds to the kind of holistic picture of like how all of these things are related. So that's something that I'll be doing with the data is testing for what are the symptoms that are clustering together. Um, and it might be depression, anxiety, but we've also seen in the literature like depression and fatigue can hang together, right? So I'm really curious. That's why I don't want to go in with like, I know which symptoms are going to be clustering. I really want to actually just do a exploratory factor analysis to see which symptoms are clustering in this sample. And then those symptom clusters will be kind of the outcomes. It'll be, we're looking at, does rumination and avoidance impact these symptoms? Are these the reasons that these symptoms as clusters are going down? And then I'm interested in the sequential ordering because in one other study in cancer survivors, that I've seen that looks at rumination and avoidance as mediators, as mechanisms of mindfulness and a causal design, did find a kind of sequential ordering of like mindfulness went down as a result of the intervention, and then rumination went down, and then later in the intervention, avoidance went down, and then depression in the end. And so this is quite curious too. When I've done some reading about this, I kind of mentioned to you the theory is that rumination is maybe a specific kind of avoidant coping mechanism or avoidant emotion regulation mechanism. Ultimately, we ruminate to try and because we think we're going to solve a problem or make the feeling go away. And so maybe that's why this really specific type of rumination or avoidant emotion regulation when that is reduced later on, the more broad avoidance of experiences of internal states then goes down later. Um, and so I'm able to really look at that question of like, is there a timing, a sequential timing of how these internal behaviors, how these emotion regulation factors change as we keep practicing mindfulness? And then does that reduce clusters of symptoms at once?
Yeah.
So yeah, anyway, I feel like I've been talking a lot
No,
again.
that's terrific. It's lots to do, and I'm fascinated by this because as you're speaking, you're also mentioning the not coming into this with preconceived notions about what is the right answer. You're doing good science and looking at, well, let's see what we find. What does the data show? What can we learn here? But also this idea of the sequencing and especially over time, what little bit of over time might be included with this, because there's other research talking about when we first engage with mindfulness, there's a bit more of mindfulness as a coping mechanism of avoidance
Yeah.
of affect. And then over time, with those who've been practicing longer, it's less about that. There's more direct engagement with difficult emotions, difficult situations that may be encountering instead. And the effects of that are like, no, I'm really embracing and dealing with and working with those difficulties. But that changes over time. And so seeing that work over time it will be really, really interesting to see. And especially those clusters too, and the outliers too. And that one of the things coming up with the cancer is fatigue, and how much of that is, what's going on in here and here, as opposed to just fatigue with the body,
Yeah.
and how some of that may be attenuated, but maybe not as much as the rumination and other things. And what is the relationship there? So lots of interesting things yet to come. I'm curious from you, what are some things you would like to see in either in cancer research or in emotion regulation, just broadly speaking? What are some things that you are really curious about for the future research?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think like to some extent it's like there's so many questions, right? There's so many areas you could go. I'd be really curious, and I know you're a mindfulness teacher. A study, and I don't know how you design this, but like it would be very interesting to know how, how like when you're teaching MBSR, you're giving people all these different ways of practicing mindfulness, right? You're giving them like the body scan, you're giving them some mindful movement, you're giving them mindful walking, you're giving them breathing exercises. I'd be so curious to know, like, on this topic of mechanisms of like, how is this practice working to reduce these symptoms? To like compare across these different ways of being mindful. Yeah, so like the different ways that these different practices might be working, the mechanisms and whether they're different, and I would suspect that yeah, breath work maybe has a different mechanism
Yeah.
for reducing depression, anxiety, or stress or fatigue than a body scan does, than yoga does. And so I think mapping on those different kinds of practice, two different mechanisms would be so fascinating and just like really useful information to have, right? If somebody comes in and they're like, I don't really have depression, anxiety, what I have is fatigue, a lot of cancer-related fatigue, we can really tailor the plan, the treatment plan, the mindfulness treatment plan for this person if we know that, hey, actually body scans don't work for fatigue, but this breath work does or the yoga does. So yeah, I just think it would be fascinating and super, super useful to do that work.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Well, for those who are interested in finding out more, I'm going to have a few links where links are found for these episodes. And I just want to thank you, Hannah, so much for being here and sharing your work, and hope you'll come back soon with the next bit of research that you're doing.
Awesome. Will do. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here today, everyone. And again, as a reminder, if you would please tap that subscribe button. It can be very helpful to this podcast and for others who are looking for it. Again, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. And I'll see you again soon on Mindfulness Voyage.